Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another chapter, Chapter 7 of Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe. It does help my channel grow, as this is about the only way to really make my channel grow. I do hope you're enjoying the festive season, and let us begin. 364 days until Halloween. Word of Jack's disappearance spread quickly throughout Halloween Town, carried like dry, fallen leaves on miasmic air. It wasn't long before every resident had heard the terrible news. They clawed out of their houses and caves and banged on the doors of town hall, demanding answers. Even the vampires dared to venture outside during the day under the protection of heavy black umbrellas. "This has never happened before," cried the clown with the tearaway face, slapping his hand against his painted cheek. "It's suspicious," the big witch with the mossy hair said. "It's peculiar," added her smaller sister. The vampire dramatically clutched at his chest with one hand while holding an umbrella with the other and gasped in unison with his companions. "It's scary." "Stand aside," the mayor said, using as much authority as he could muster to push through the crowd. He wore a grim face ever since Jack's house, and feared he'd never have a reason to switch to his smiling one again. In his hurry, he accidentally shoved the wolfman, who whirled on him with a warning growl. But the mayor was so distracted that he hardly noticed. Coming through, he ordered as he maneuvered his topsy-turvy body up a ladder onto the top of his hearse, where he promptly lost his balance and fell. He managed to right himself and took hold of the megaphone. He announced into it, "We've got to find Jack. There's only 365 days left until next Halloween." 364, growled the wolfman, who was still irritated. The mayor moaned. It was true. Now he was even losing track of the days. They were going to run out of time to plan the most frightening Halloween ever. The concerned residents fretted. "Is there anywhere we forgot to check?" the mayor pleaded. "I looked through every mausoleum," the clown with the tearaway face swore, rocking tightly back and forth on his tiny unicycle. "I opened this sarcophagi." "Oh, we opened the sarcophagi," the witches said in unison. Mr. Hyde stammered up in his dented top hat and green coat. One of his feet was stuck in a pumpkin, and in his worry, he hadn't even stopped to free it. "I trumped through the pumpkin patch. Nothing." One of the vampires who had won the award for the most blood-drained added in a raspy voice, "I peeked behind the Cyclops' eye." When the witch sisters cracked with a disbelieving sneer, he insisted, "I did." He pulled out his own eyeball for emphasis. before letting it snap back into place. He blinked a few times to make sure it had settled and then sighed, but he wasn't there. The mayor nodded decisively. It's time to sound the alarm. Mummy Boy climbed up on the hearse with considerably more agility than the mayor had and began to crank the tail of the black cat siren, which let out a shrieking wail of alarm. High atop the castle, Sally heard the alarm as she was in the midst of preparing Dr. Finkelstein's soup. She leaned out the kitchen window, trying to figure out why everyone was gathered. Stuck in the castle, she hadn't heard the news about Jack's disappearance. What did the alarm signal? Had a vampire spent too long in the sunlight? Was a plague of locusts swarming on the pumpkin patch? She had the same churn up feeling in her stomach she had the night before when she'd listened to Jack's musing in the graveyard. Please don't let anything have happened to Jack. There was only one thing to do. Good thing she'd gathered the extra nightshade. She cooked her head to listen to the crackle? She cocked her head to listen to the creaks and moans of the castle. She didn't hear any sign of Finkelstein's wheelchair. He was working on a new experiment in his laboratory. Something perplexing that enveloped the precious hand in a jar. Oh, preserved hand in a jar. Blip. And it kept him so busy that he'd skipped breakfast. Now it was almost lunchtime, which meant the doctor must be starving. So starved he might not look too closely at what he was served. She threw open the cupboard, hunting through the jars for the nightshade. One had to be careful when brewing with poison. Too little would only give the victim a bout of nausea. Too much and they die. Sally didn't want to kill Dr. Finkelstein. He'd made her after all. And she had a soft spot for lonely old researchers. I entitle everyone to go read Long Live the Pumpkin Queen then. Picking back up. She only wanted to put him to sleep. Besides, if he threw up from a botched poisoning, she'd be the one to have to clean it up. She carefully measured a portion of nightshade and mixed it into the soup that was simmering in the kitchen cauldron. A noxious burst of steam rose from the pot, and she reeked backwards, pinching her nose as she waved away the vile odor. One whiff of this telltale scent, and Dr. Finkelstein would know exactly what she was up to. She grabbed a jar off the kitchen shelf and unscrewed the cap. Frog's breath will overpower any odor. At her prodding, the frog inside the jar stretched himself and gave a nice rip belch into the stew. She pinched her nose again against the smell. It was so pungent that it might make her head spin. And she coughed dizzy as she set down the jar and stumbled her way across the kitchen to the cabinet where she kept her ingredients. Bitter, she opened the cabinet with a groan of hinges as she continued to cough. Wormswort, she wheezed. Where's that wormswort? She tossed jars and canisters over her head until she found it. There we go. Thought Wormsworth was precious. It was worth using the last of her stores of it to mask the trace of poison and frog's breath. Didn't quite hide. Besides, Dr. Finkelstein adored Wormsworth. Surely he'd suck down the soup without giving a second thought. Somewhere overhead, a door squeaked open. Sally! Dr. Finkelstein's sharp voice snaked down the spiraling ramp. Is that soup ready yet? From the third story down, she could practically hear his stomach growling. She poured the wormswort into the soup at arm's length, not wanting to breathe in the vapors. Then she cocked her head, pleading, "Coming!" She ladled out a bowl and carefully carried it up the long ramp to his laboratory. Dr. Finkelstein was stooped over his work table, deep in his thoughts. X-rays of various body parts were set out next to the preserved hand in a jar. He mused to himself, confused by his latest experiment. He opened his skull cap and gave his brain a nice juicy scratch, waking up the synapses that then closed his head with a squeak of its hinge. Lunch, lunch, Sally announced proudly. Lunch, Sally announced proudly. He moved aside his equipment and wheeled his chair closer to the table. What's that? Sally plastered an innocent smile on her face as the doctor leaned forward to give the stew a deep inhale, his stomach rumbling audibly. He beamed. Wormsworth. He clenched the spoon and raised it to his thin, quivering lips. Sally leaned forward with her hands clasped and her eyes big, silently urging him to take a sip. But a second before he touched the greenish brine to his lips, he stopped. All trace of excitement fell off his face. Behind his black glasses, his thin eyes narrowed, and frog's breath. Sally blinked her big eyes extra dramatically, feigning confusion. Well, what's wrong? I thought you liked frog's breath. Dr. Finkelstein waved the spoon in the air as he squinted at her from behind his glasses. Nothing's more suspicious than frog's breath, he sighed to himself. Here he'd gone and taken a chance with Sally, made something soft, something pliable, but there was a scheming brain in her head behind that stitched on smile. He slid the bowl towards her and demanded, "Until you taste it, I won't swallow a spoonful." Sally immediately huffed, "I'm not hungry." She was an above average actress, and she enjoyed putting on a little display. She threw her arms like a petulant child, intentionally knocking the spoon out of the doctor's hand, then clattered onto the floor beneath the table, and she cried, "Oops." Bending down, she quietly kicked the spoon further under the table, and while out of sight, she pulled a strainer spoon from her wool socks, where she tucked it before going to the laboratory. "You want me to starve," Dr. Finkelstein groaned as he waited. "An old man like me, who hardly has strength as it is. Me, to whom you owe your very life." Sally popped up, grinning from ear to ear. She was relieved that she'd hadn't had the idea to bring along the strainer spoon just in case. "Oh, don't be silly," she said, taking the bowl of soup. She held it high above his head, gratefully again that he couldn't stand up from his chair, so he couldn't see that when she dipped in her strainer spoon, the greenish brine simply drained out from the holes immediately. She tapped the empty spoon towards her lips and pretended to slurp with a big sip. See? Scrumptious." Sally slid the bowl back towards Dr. Finkelstein, satisfied with her demonstration. He embraced it ravenously, drinking directly from the bowl. Wormswort was his favorite, and Sally hadn't made it for ages. Good old Sally had been needlessly he had been needlessly paranoid to think she would try to trick him again. "Oh, how wrong you were, sweet summer child." He slurped down the entire bowl, licking his thin lips with gusto. He gave a satisfied belch, and Sally grinned wider, clenching her hands together against her chest. Now she just had to wait and hope she hadn't accidentally killed her creator. End of Chapter 7. We'll be picking back up Chapter 8 on the next episode. Please remember to like, share, comment, subscribe. And once again, thank you for your time.